Well, I guess that title of disruptor fits me pretty well since I kind of fit crossways in science rather completely. And um, if I'm successful in some physics experiments that I have now that I'm working on raising funds to get them done, I will be even a more effective disruptor because they will change everything in science, basically putting the last nail in the coffin of materialism, showing, demonstrating experimentally that this couldn't possibly be a materialistic world, and that leaves it being an information-based world in its place, which is a concept that changes everything. Not only will it change science at the core. Science will never be the same again. Any of the sciences. But besides that, our social connections, same things that you are working toward, trying to improve the dysfunctionality we have in our social structures. These experiments and my philosophy, my work, will be a huge disruptor in the social section as well, and it will tend to push the world into a kinder, gentler, more cooperative space, which I think is probably pretty much in line with what you're trying to do, trying to get out of that greedy, self-centered, self-serving space that kind of uses everyone for the benefit of the few.
Yeah.
So I think maybe in the next decade or two, given that my experiments work well and message gets around, that we may be seeing a big change, a big shift in people's attitudes toward the nature of reality, toward why they're here, what the purpose of their life is. And that bigger picture, I think, will maybe go a long way to fixing some of these social issues that we have to deal with. So, yes, I'm a disruptor and probably been a disruptor all my life. I've just been one of these people that never could really deal very well with authority. When I would run into authority that says do it because that's the way it's done and because I say so and so on, just the bristles, up my spine, and I just never did like that. So I was always kind of counter to whatever culture I was in at the time and whatever set of rules it is that I had to abide by. So that's been my life. I think that's probably defines me from a very young age, and still defines me now. I go my own way, do my own thing, and try to make enough sense that other people uh, agree with me or see it my way, and also will move toward this kinder, gentler place that I'm trying to create. So we both are working in the same sort of business, if you will, but just from very different directions. What I'm trying to do is demonstrate scientifically what people's purpose is here. My work scientifically starts with a couple of assumptions, and that is that consciousness exists, and then that um, evolution exists as a concept. Evolution simply being that a system that can changes, and stuff that works better within its environment continues on, and stuff that doesn't work so well tends to go away. So that concepts exist, and just with those two assumptions, I can produce a very cogent theory of consciousness, and from the theory of consciousness, I can derive physics and solve physics problems that otherwise have never been solved, like why should particles be expressed as probability distribution, or why should the speed of light be a constant? How does tunneling work? And a whole host of quantum mechanics and other scientific issues, like what was before the Big Bang? Where did that little ball of plasma at that high temperature and high pressure come from that science says was the beginning of our universe? It had to come from someplace, because it didn't come from our universe, because our universe hadn't been created yet from that ball of plasma. So it had to come from somewhere else. So science has all of these problems that are called paradoxes, that they just don't know what the answers are. And this philosophy of mine that really is born out of a model of consciousness answers those questions. The same principles that explain consciousness also explain physics. And physics is one of the root sciences. Chemistry basically reduces to physics. Biology often reduces to physics and chemistry. So it's the fundamental thing in science. The only thing more fundamental, I guess, in the logic spectrum than physics is mathematics itself. So that's sort of my business. Okay, so what is my business? I guess your listeners would like to hear. Well, I'm a physicist. You might guess by just talking about physics. I'm a physicist, and I worked probably 35 years, going on 40 years as a professional physicist in many places. I've worked for Army Technical Intelligence, for missile defense, and for NASA, and for a host of contractors that mainly served government, but sometimes other things. So I'm an applied physicist, not an academic physicist. An applied physicist does physics to solve problems in the real world. An academic physicist basically does research just because they want to know, without any particular application in mind. So that's really the difference. The real world physicists like me always have to perform. We have to solve problems. If we don't solve problems, then we're out. Industry doesn't keep people around who don't help the bottom line, don't solve problems. In academia, once you get tenure, you just kind of do what it is you want to do. You have a lot of freedom to work on the things you want to work on. And it's a different kind of life. It's a very political life in academia, and that the politics in academia is what drove me out of that venue. Again, I don't have a good tolerance for arbitrary authority. So very, very political situations tend to make me go someplace else. Anyway, here I am, a physicist just in graduate school. I learned how to meditate because it was promised in a poster that if you meditated, you could get by with less sleep. And if you're a graduate student in physics, you work, at least 12 hours a day, if not more like 15, because once you start experiments, you have to stay with the experiment, whether that means you stay up all night for 4 or 5 nights or whatever, and you're taking courses, and it's just a very busy time. So this idea about meditating and getting by with less sleep sounded like a good deal to me. So I did that. I learned how to meditate, and in about 3 months, I realized that meditation gave me some skills that I couldn't explain, that I didn't understand, and it broadened my whole sense of what reality was like. I found out that I could debug my computer code, and those were back in the bad old days when you couldn't just run debug programs. You had boxes of cards, and you were working. You had to really spend a lot of time debugging because you only got 1, maybe 2 runs at best a week. That's, the university would have one computer, and everybody in the university had to share that one computer. That was decades before personal computers. And in those days, the computers only had about as much speed and power to them as probably your cell phone has today. They just weren't all that strong, and my needs took a lot of computer time. So if I got 1 run a week, that was it, and you didn't want to waste that 1 run because there was a key punch error. A hole in the card wasn't quite aligned right. You see, that could take a whole week just to find that. So debugging was important, and I could bring up my code in my mind, look at all the lines of code, which I knew precisely because I wrote all of them, and the ones that had problems with them, had errors or things that would bomb the computer, they were in red, and the rest were in black on white, the way it normally was. So I said, wow, that's interesting, and I checked it out, and sure enough, those ones that were in red were ones with problems. So I started debugging my code that way, and that was maybe 100 times more effective, more efficient than actually going through the code and trying to find problems. So as a physicist, I had this idea that if you couldn't measure it, it didn't matter. If you couldn't measure it, it wasn't real. That's called an operational definition of reality. And when I was able to debug computer by seeing different colors in my mind, I knew there was more to reality than things you could measure, because this was the process itself was unmeasurable. It was all subjective, not objective, and it worked. So then I had this idea, well, reality's got more components to it than I realized. It's a much bigger thing than just what you can measure. I mean, I could measure the results of it. I really was good at debugging code now, but I couldn't measure the process itself. It was just mysterious. So then, when I left graduate school, I had an opportunity to go talk to Bob Monroe. Bob Monroe was in his 50s then. He's a guy and he had just a year or two before written a book called Journeys Out of the Body. He was this guy that just had out-of-body experiences. He would just kind of wake up and wasn't in the physical reality anymore. And he thought he was going insane. He thought that he needed help. He tried not to have them. They scared him half to death, but they happened to him anyway. He couldn't stop it. So he decided just to play with it and see what it was or what he could do with it. And then he wrote this book that was kind of like his diary of what he experienced. And I wanted to know, is this guy crazy? Or is this guy just trying to sell books? Or, has he really run across something bigger in reality? Because by then, I was about 3 years after the point where I realized reality was bigger, that I could do things with my mind that shouldn't be able to do. So I was open to a bigger picture of reality, and I wondered whether this guy had anything that he could help me help me understand it, because that's what physicists do. They try to understand the nature of the reality they live in, and I wanted to understand how I was doing this. And so when I saw Bob Monroe, I realized that he wasn't trying to sell books. He was a very wealthy guy. You come into his estate and you drive along this road with a whiteboard fence and a mansion on the hill, horses running alongside the fence. And I thought, no, he's not trying to sell books. That's chump change compared to, what he has, obviously. So when I talked to him, he was a straight guy, and he wanted to turn his experience into science. He didn't want to be just a crazy old man that, had strange experiences. He wanted it to be more than that. He wanted it to be science. So he had built this lab to study consciousness, and I just happened to be there to help him man it. He had no idea. It was one of these things. Remember the movie Build It and They Will Come? Well, that's the way he was. It was about baseball, I think. But he built this lab and had no idea why, but he just knew he had to build it. And myself and another guy that worked with me, he was a double E. We came out to Bob's, and he was looking for scientists, and we thought it would be a lot of fun if we could learn what Bob learned. So we made a deal. We said, all right, we'll be your free scientists, and you teach us what you know about going out of body, because if we can't experience it, it won't be real to us. It won't be something we can really study. We have to know about it in our own mind. We don't just want to study you. We want to study the phenomena, and we have to experience it to do that. So he agreed. So we started coming out to his place, to his lab, 15 to 20 hours a week in the evening. So now I had a day job and a night job. I had a probably 50-hour a week day job and about a 15 to 20 hour a week night job studying consciousness. So my careers in physics and consciousness research all got launched, within a couple of months of each other. So I've been dual careered all this time. And eventually, Bob was a good teacher, so I learned to do the things that he was doing. I learned to get into these non-physical spaces with my awareness, but I had no idea what it meant or how real it was or what did it mean? How could I do it? I could get information that was paranormal. That means that I normally shouldn't have had access to, just like my computer code. I was getting information, but I didn't know why or how. So I spent the next 35 years of my life doing research to try to find out how, why, what are the limits, what's the fundamentals behind this, because that's what physicists do. They try to model reality. So 35 years later, I thought I understood consciousness well enough to write it down, and I published these books, My Big Toe, and toe, of course, is is the acronym TOE, theory of everything. And basically, I thought that what I had was a theory of consciousness. But I also knew that consciousness was fundamental and that the physical world was somehow a derivative of this consciousness. It wasn't fundamental. And my research had shown me that very plainly, but I didn't really understand how we got from consciousness to the physical world. So about 2 years after I had published these 3 books, I got a big aha moment. Somebody said something on a different subject altogether, and it just triggered me. And I've realized that I understood quantum mechanics, and nobody else in physics did. And I understood why they had to be probability distributions. It all made sense. The same logical understanding that explained consciousness explained quantum mechanics. So I said, wow, that's good. I got quantum mechanics now. What else can I get? What's the other big thing? Well, the other big thing in physics is relativity. Quantum mechanics and relativity basically are now modern physics. They make up all of physics. Those 2 things are the big monsters in the conceptual bag of physics. So I started thinking, why is c a constant? That's the underlying unknown in relativity theory. Why should the speed of light be a constant? And within only about a day's worth of thinking about it, that popped right out of the consciousness theory as well. It was perfectly clear why c had to be a constant. So then I started looking at other things like tunneling and Zeno effect and all these other things in physics that were mysteries, that were paradoxes, like where did that ball of plasma come from in the Big Bang? Because it couldn't have come from our universe, and if our universe is all reality that it is, then there's a logical problem there. You can't just pop a ball of plasma out of nothing for no reason. That doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, that made sense too. So my concept of consciousness did much better physics. And I've just, in 2016 in LA, I did a presentation of a set of physics experiments that would help verify these things that I'm saying, that this is indeed a information-based reality. And interesting enough, when I was coming up with all this and defining kind of a new physics, a new viewpoint of physics, it turns out that the fundamental key there is that that reality is it's an information-based system, not a material-based system. It's based on information. That means a virtual reality, a computed reality. And at the time, when I published my books, which is 2003 in February, me and maybe 2 other people in the planet thought virtual reality was a good idea. Everybody else thought it was crazy. And now, a decade and a half later, probably 30% of the physics department thinks virtual reality is really something worth studying, because their experiments for the last 100 years have been telling them, that this is not a material reality. That's not fundamental. There's something else more fundamental than that, but they just didn't know what. They didn't have the right concepts, but they're beginning to see that it is information. It's information-based. So you take one of the really big guns in physics, John Archibald Wheeler. All the big physicists you've heard of probably were his students. He did a lot of original work. He was the one that coined the term black hole. He was the one that coined the term it from bit, it being the universe, bit being from information. And so he's one of the smartest and probably top of the pile physicists of the last century. And his comment is that he said, when I started physics, I thought everything was particles. And then I realized that particles couldn't be the basis of everything. So then I thought everything was fields. And then I realized that fields couldn't be the base of everything. And now I know that reality is information. Everything is information. So he was one of those 2 or 3 in the world that agreed with me back in 2003. And so my work then has gone and taken that idea and said, how does this make sense? Why does it work that way? What's the logic of this being an information-based reality? Well, the reason that was natural to me and my theory of consciousness is I'd already had written in my books about consciousness being an information system. It was just information. And that's not hard to understand because, what are you conscious of? Well, it's all your senses, right? You got 5 senses, and all those senses collect information. And it's discrete or digital information. So a photon, a discrete piece of energy, hits your eyeball, gets focused by the lens, hits the retina, creates a discrete electric signal. That electric pulse runs down your optic nerve into the optic processing part of your brain, and modifies a little different pattern of neurons and changes things there, and you interpret that data as what you see. So that's the nature of consciousness, is it takes in information, it interprets the information into a reality. So that was my idea of consciousness. That was the fundamental thing of consciousness. So then when I just extrapolated that to the physical world, it was easy. The physical world is a creation. It's a simulation created in consciousness. Of course, it's digital and information based, because consciousness is digital information based, and then everything else fell out. All the rest of the physics and the psychology and the metaphysics and even theology just all fell out as a logical process. No more assumptions than those first 2 I told you about, and everything became logic after that. So my books are kind of the only on-ramp to metaphysics that logical people, left-brain people that demand logical process, can read. I mean, we've had people understand this for millennia. The Buddha, 2,500 years ago, said reality was an illusion. Well, that's pretty close to saying it's a virtual reality. You see, it's not. Matter is not fundamental, is what he was saying. And he was right, because he explored inner space. People have been able to explore inner space, millennia ago. All they needed was enough time to sit and think and experience and understand, and the answers are there. So we find in history, in almost every part of the world, there's been people who understood this bigger picture, that this physical reality is not fundamental, that it's information based. And we have like the Hopi Indians saying that what we think's the physical reality is a dream, and after you die you wake up from the dream. We've had this kinds of thing in cultures all over the place, and it turns out they're all right. That is the way it works. And now it's I can explain that scientifically, logically, rather than in poetry. Like, we live in a dream, and when you die here you wake up from the dream. That's poetry. You have to kind of interpret, well, what does that mean? With my work, all you have to do is read and follow the logic. It's not a matter of poetry or in trying to interpret it. It's just the way it works out. Okay, so that's kind of where I come from, and how a nice physicist like me ended up, talking about consciousness and metaphysics and theology and a lot of other things. But so that's kind of my story. If you like, I'll give you a little overview of what the books are all about. I can maybe give you a quick overview of that if you want to do that next.
Yeah, for me, I'll interject here and give you a moment to rest from the speaking. It's astounding to hear some of this stuff. So for me, I dropped out of school at an early age, around grade 8, grade 9, and I started studying music and sacred plant medicines. And you're right, a lot of the understanding of that is akin to poetry and very flowery, because for someone like myself, from trying to explain something that is beyond it is a lot of inner space that I was traversing. So for you to come to the table and have a logical proof for some of this stuff is a backing that I think, like you were saying, will change the way we operate in the universe and more specifically on the world that we live in. Because if it changes field theory, it means we can accomplish a whole bunch of things that we didn't realize were possible with likely technology or even just our own mindsets. Before you dive into what the books are about, was there any really pushed experiences on the stuff or the work you did with Bob Monroe on out of body experiences that kind of shocked you, or
Well, yes, it was kind of interesting. Dennis and I went out there, like I say, about 15 to 20 hours a week, and every time was weird and strange and interesting stuff that you couldn't explain happened, and we were just collecting data, and we knew from keeping the kind of statistics about what we were doing, the information we were getting, and we tried to do things that were evidential. We only wanted to do stuff that we could then check to see if it was, if there was something objective there. So we were, trying to read newspaper headlines a week in advance. We were trying to read numbers that were written on a blackboard after we got into our booths and were isolated visually and acoustically and electromagnetically from the rest of the world. We did a lot of remote viewing. We did healing. We did all kinds of things that we had read about that you could do with consciousness. And we wanted to know, did they really work? Could you do these things? Yeah. And they were evidential. So we did them and did them and did them. And the feedback we got is, yes, you could do them. And yes, they did work. And the statistics were like, 10,000 to 1 that we were just kidding ourselves and that they really didn't. And it was just good luck that you happened to be able to read that, 10-digit number on the board. That was just lucky, so you had all this intellectual information about it. Yes, it was real and it could work, but neither one of us had a clue why or what was going on. So we didn't really get it, or I should say believe it, kind of at a gut deep level. Because it's just like that, particularly if you're a left brain scientist like, we were, you just can't believe, you get it intellectually, say, okay, yeah, all right, 10,000 to 1, it really exists, but I don't know, and it's hard to actually give it up, at the basic core level of your sense of reality until Dennis and I one day did an experiment with Bob, where he asked the two of us to meet above in the air, above the lab, go out of body, meet there, and then go on some sort of an adventure, travel around in the non-physical together. And the key was always stay together and interact together as you're doing this. Well, we did that. It was easy for us at that point. So we met up above the lab, and then we went off, and for the next 2 hours, we did things that were very evidential. You have to do things that are unique, otherwise there's no evidence. If all you did is sit in a gray cloud and say, yeah, we were together, we both saw a gray cloud all the time, well, that doesn't mean anything. You have to do things that are really unique. And we did. We saw things. We had conversations with each other. Wow. We pointed out things. Well, look at that over there. Do you see how that, and the other person would comment on it. So when we came back, and of course, both of us were isolated. We were each in separate rooms that were completely acoustically isolated from each other, and one of them was electromagnetically isolated from the rest of the universe with a solid metal, enclosure that was grounded around it. So there was no way, if somebody screamed, you might hear a little muffle, noise in the other one, but we were just talking very quietly to a microphone that was hanging from the ceiling right above our mouths as we lay in these beds, and we were telling Bob in the control room what we were seeing, what was going on, what our conversations were about. So we were each just isolated and had no sense of the other one at all in the physical, but we did in the non-physical. So we come out of this lab after 2 hours of this experience, and we step out into the control room, and Bob kind of looked at us and he said, well, did you two think you were together? And we looked at each other, and I said, yeah, it seemed like it. And Dennis said, yeah, it seemed like it. And he said, well, listen to this. And he flipped the two switches because he had Dennis on one cassette tape and me on another cassette tape. So he flipped the two cassette tapes at the same time to start them running. And there we were answering each other's questions, having a conversation back and forth on these tapes. And they were totally isolated. Physically, we were isolated. We were seeing the same things. We were having a discussion, and we sounded like two people who were together off on some trip someplace, and they were describing what they saw. So that floored me. My jaw dropped open, and I wasn't the same for about 2 weeks. For about 2 or 3 weeks, I staggered around in a semi-coma thinking, Jesus, this stuff's real. I mean, this stuff's really real, and that hit me like a ton of bricks. And after that, I didn't question it anymore. I didn't have this gut feeling of, yeah, okay, statistics say it's real, but I don't know what's really going on. I still didn't know what was going on, but I no longer questioned the fact that this was real. It actually was just the way it seemed like it was. There wasn't any trick. There wasn't any clever, things going on behind the scenes that would explain it somehow, which is kind of, I guess, what we keep in our mind because it's hard for us to actually accept that this is real. But that was it for me. And that just kind of knocked my socks off. And after that, it was just a matter of, okay, how does it work?
Yeah.
What's going on? What can you do? What can't you do? What are the limits and why? And then I spend like the next 35 years trying to figure all those questions out. And then I got to writing the book. So yeah, I did have working with Bob. That was my big aha moment that I no longer had to question about the reality of it. I only needed to focus on the why of it, the how of it. So that was big for me. And, it wasn't that big for Dennis. Dennis didn't get that same jaw-dropping thing. He did later for something else. And for a while, and you might think that, well, how could you not get your jaw dropped on that? Well, it's because we've been going there already now for like 2 years, 2.5 years that we've been coming out. And every night was totally weird. Every night was, beyond bizarre. And we were just taking all this information in without any sense of understanding why it could happen, what made it possible. But we knew that it was there. So, the fact that we did something that night that was totally, you know, um, out of this world, totally, no, like I say, knock your socks off. Well, for Dennis, it was just another weird night at the lab. He didn't get the same deep reaction I had, but anyway, so
So
that was it. Some big aha moment.
before we leave, so this is around 1983, around 35 years ago. You're saying, and I guess the question I want to ask was: there a type of meditation you guys are practicing, or were you just playing in the field of what worked with breathing techniques before we move on from that particular space?
Okay, well, it really was in like mid 70s. We're probably about 1975 there,
Okay.
not 1983. And anyway, we tried to look at everything that we could find in the literature about out of body, about consciousness, about paranormal, about the things that we were doing. And basically, we came up pretty much empty-handed. There was really nothing out there that was even close to being science. It was all just a bunch of stuff where people were saying, here's what I did, and here's what happened to me. And sometimes they'd have a scientist or somebody studying them, and they verified, yeah, this is what that guy thought. But there was absolutely no understanding. Nobody said, here's why it works. And if they did say that, it was unbelievable. Okay, there's this subtle body that lives inside of you, and we'll call it ectoplasm, and it oozes out of the top of your head and is attached with a silver cord, to keep it connected. There was that kind of stuff, but that was just all, somebody making stuff up to try to explain their experiences. None of it had the sound or the ring of truth or science to it. So we really didn't have anything. I think the first book we read that sounded like it was even rational was one by Jane Roberts called Seth Speaks. And that had been written late 60s, I guess, early 70s. And at least Seth had a rational viewpoint of, reality. He said it was we lived in a multidimensional reality. Well, that seemed to be true. Exactly what that meant, I didn't know. And Seth didn't really tell you exactly what that meant either, but at least it made sense. So Seth Speaks was kind of our first book that gave us, a few clues about how to look at the processes that we were experiencing. But even that had very few answers, and there was some stuff about it that just didn't fit. It wasn't accurate with our own experience. But at least it was a start. So of all the literature and all the things we tried, there's breathing techniques. This is meditation techniques. There's breathing techniques, and there's mantras, and there's that I did with TM, and there's lots of that other stuff. But that's just to help you get into an altered state of consciousness that is a good meditation state. That's just the kind of the pre-work you have to do. Getting into a state of what I call point consciousness, where you are a point of consciousness floating in a black void. And that's all you are. You're just aware that you exist and nothing else. You don't have any sense data whatsoever. You don't feel a body. You don't see anything. You don't hear anything. It's sort of the Descartes moment. I exist, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. So this awareness of point conscious, which was an endpoint for a lot of the yogis and people in the Eastern cultures, that was nirvana. You got there, and it was a very peaceful, pleasant, wonderful experience. But for us, that's just the starting point. That's the doorway. That's step one. You got to learn to get there and hold that as a very stable state. And after that, your intent can do some marvelous things, because after that, you can start roaming around in the larger consciousness system and applying your consciousness to things that are measurable here. So that's really the only thing we got out of kind of current understanding was that this point consciousness state was square one. That's where you needed to start. So you needed to learn to meditate so that you could get to that point consciousness and have it as a very steady state where you could stay there for 2 hours if you wanted to. So that's the starting point. So we didn't get much. We read Eastern philosophy, and Eastern philosophy seemed to have a lot of our experiences down okay, understood, the things we were realizing about the world, but it was poetry. It wasn't science. And, I'm a physicist. I can't use poetry. I can use it to verify that, yeah, okay, I understand what they're talking about from my experience, but there's nothing there about why. Why is it like that? What are the limitations? Where did it come from? That kind of thing. And how does it work? Which is what I wanted to understand. So I didn't really find much. So I just had to figure it all out myself, which is probably why it took me 35 years, to get to the point that I understood it, because I was doing research in these non-physical spaces. In other words, I'd go into a non-physical space and do something that I could measure here, and then I'd repeat that process with a variable change. I'd change one thing about it, and then I'd do it again and see what difference it made. And then I'd change another variable and do it again and see what difference it made. That's just standard science. That's how you do science. You try to isolate variables and see what variables is causing what effects. And you have to be able to repeat it accurately enough so that you don't enter any unknown or new variables into the mix. But by then, I could go into these altered states very precisely and repeat things very precisely. So eventually, I just did enough research in the non-physical and in the non-physical as it affected the physical, so that I could figure out a little bit about what was going on and how it worked. And I guess the big aha there was that it was all information. And once I got the information, then about 20 pieces of the puzzle suddenly all fit together and made a nice picture. So that's kind of how I got to it.
So my last question here too is, so in 1975, what the regular day job, where were you working at this time, and what were the conversations with other colleagues? What did those sound like? And because again, in the disruptive space, you're often battling a little bit more of a stubborn viewpoint from some of your associates. How did those conversations go, and how did your work progress from leaving maybe where you're working in 1975?
Okay, well, in 1975, I was working for a technical intelligence, Army Technical Intelligence. At that time, it was called Foreign Science and Technology Center. Since then, it's changed its name. I think it calls itself National Ground Intelligence Center now, NGIC. But it was FSTC, Foreign Science Technology Center. And my boss was very into the same thing. He had actually come out to Bob's with us, and he was the guy that first read the book, Journeys Out of the Body. He was an electrical engineer. He was the one that got the group together, found out where Bob lived, and went out to meet him when I met Bob for the first time. So talking to him was very easy, and that's good because he was my boss. And of course, there was Dennis, who also worked there. So he and I were in that together. But in general, we didn't talk about it too much to anybody else because it was very unbelievable if you didn't have the experience. And neither Dennis nor I, nor Bill Yost, who was my boss, we didn't have any explanations. So if you don't have an explanation of how it works, then there's really no point bringing it up. It just makes yourself look like a fool because you can't explain it. But once you have an explanation, now you can bring it up and say, look, here it is. This makes sense. But until you have that, I thought it was better just to keep a low profile and not say a whole lot. So I was pretty invisible, I guess, until 2003 when I published the books.
Okay.
Now, once I published the books, now my career as a disruptor, in a big way started because I was talking about science in a way that nobody was thinking about it at the time. And like I say, I started as me and a couple of other people on the planet who thought this way, and now it's a thing. So it's gone in 1.5 decades from that's absolutely crazy and ridiculous, that couldn't possibly be true, to something that is being considered pretty much in every physics department in the country. This idea that it's a virtual reality is taken very seriously, and that because the physicists know that our reality is information based. It used to be that science said an electron was a little chunk of mass with a charge. Science doesn't say that anymore. They've gone past the particle thing. Now they're saying that it's a point with the attributes of mass and the attributes of charge. You see, that's a different thing, a totally different animal than it used to be. And that's because if you think of it as a little chunk of mass, you can't compute any of the right answers. It doesn't act like that. It acts like a point with attributes, not like a piece of material mass. So they've already had a lot of science pushing them toward information is the key thing, but they just didn't know what to do with it. And because it violated their belief system, which is a belief system in materialism and in determinism, that's the fundamental belief in science, that materialism and determinism is the fundamental truth. Well, this stuff just totally blew that truth apart. It was very destructive of their belief system. So they've been struggling now for almost 100 years, trying to somehow justify their beliefs in materialism and in determinism. But it just gets harder and harder as the experiments come in. It's tougher and tougher for them to justify, these beliefs. And hopefully my experiments will kind of pull the rug out from, the last vestiges of their ability to hold on to materialism, and will show them that the stuff that my experiments will show will make it perfectly clear that it couldn't happen in a materialistic world, but yet it happens anyway. So that's where my becoming more of an agitator and a against the grain sort of person was when I put my books out and then started talking about science theory and then did these experiments. So I'm kind of pushing the physics world to see this as a virtual reality, but they don't want to because that's not a material reality. So though their science tells them that's the way it is, they resist because they want to hang on to the old beliefs. Those beliefs are what put them in power. Those beliefs is what they've spent careers on those beliefs. So they're invested in those beliefs, and it's really difficult for them to let that go, particularly when the virtual reality tells us that there's something else more fundamental than the physical reality, and that something else is non-physical. It's consciousness. You see? So for scientists to say, oh, we're just a subset of something non-physical, that just freaks them out. They can't deal with those concepts because it's just too big a step away from materialism and determinism. And also that this reality of ours is not deterministic, it's probabilistic. That also freaks them out, even though quantum mechanics has been telling them that since 1914. So it's really hard for them to turn around this corner away from materialism. But if you think about it, materialism is really at the root of our attitudes about greed and about it's all about
Hmm.
me and get as much as you can. That basically stems out of a concept of this material world. It's a pie, and there's only so many pieces of this pie to go around. So what we're supposed to do is grab as much of it as we can, and make sure that other people, don't get it, that we get it, and then we have to hold it. Once we get it, we have to protect it. So that's kind of the idea that drives all the rest of the greed and control and other social problems that we have, is this idea of what our purpose is here, why we're here, what's important for us to do. Well, it's not grab as much as we can grab, and and figure out ways to holding on to it so other people can't grab it from us. That's not the point. The
Yeah.
point is very different.
Yeah, this next part, where we're bridging into, I think, is where part two of this kind of starts, and it's the idea that science, from that materialist standpoint, is very nihilistic. That there's not necessarily even a purpose for why we're here. And in
Right.
some of the thoughts, you talk about a lowered state of entropy, which is complexity but with less chaos. What I really like about this is it starts to resonate with a lot of the lessons that I was getting from the plants and the music that I was working with when I was younger. That the development of a lot of these centers is apparent too in some of the abstract stories. So then you get into things like the ego and survival, because those are very animalistic viewpoints of, or centers of information. And that those centers of information, from a survival standpoint, they have a function and a use, obviously, because they're part of how nature interacts with itself and perceives the data that's coming into it. But there are also these higher centers of perception of different data points as well, so that the different chakra systems, there's parallels in all these different religions that became very apparent to me, and that have subtle mathematics associated to it as well. So is from the My Big Toe, the acronym for theory of everything, is this when you started to and when, as you're becoming more of an agitator, is this when you started to add some more of the philosophical and conceptual changes that happen from the mind altering experience of realizing that it isn't a materialistic world, and it has that there is a purpose to what's taking place here?
Yes, absolutely. It was a big it was a big aha moment for me when I realized what really the nature of this reality was. Once I understood consciousness, I had to understand what was it doing. What was its purpose? What was it that made it tick? What was the driving force, the driving concepts within consciousness? And I found out that it was to lower entropy. Okay, if you have an information system, and information is order, it's content, it's construct. If you have a system where all the digits, where all the bits in the system are all random, there's no information. That's the maximum entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder. So if there's no order, if all the bits in the information system are random, there's no information. So it requires order, or lowering entropy, in order to create information. So an information system, to evolve and to maintain, particularly now we're talking about a conscious information system, right? It's consciousness. This is the larger consciousness system, is an information system. So it wants to lower its entropy, create more information, more useful information, and that's its process of evolving. Whereas de-evolution to a consciousness system is becoming more random, becoming higher entropy, losing order, losing constructs and structures that are meaningful. So that's what's important. And then we can take a couple of steps here, and maybe it's going to introduce what we talk about next. But we might talk for 2 hours now, and 2 hours day after tomorrow as well. And you may just have to put this out as 4 or 5 or more things, because in an hour you just can't do much but scratch the surface. I mean, after all, this is a theory of everything, and you can't talk about everything, in an hour. It just doesn't work. But anyhow, where I'm going with this is that, and I'll skip some steps just to kind of get to the chase more quickly, and then I'll let you decide whether you want to go on or whether you want to stop here. And that is that, so we have this consciousness system, and it was a monolithic thing. It was consciousness, and it wanted to lower its entropy. It wanted to create more useful information, but it kind of was stuck because it's this one monolithic thing, and it didn't have enough decision space, enough choices, enough possibilities that it could move into. And what it did is what everything else does when it gets to that state, and that is it decided that interacting with itself was stilted. It could only do that so much. So it had to interact with another, with something else that was also had free will, as it did, and was able to interact with it, because now there'd be a lot of things that you couldn't predict, a lot of things that would suddenly make choices. You'd have interaction going on, not just interaction with yourself, but with something else that was totally, detached from you, something else with its own free will. And because it was everything, then to do this, it had to break itself into some pieces, some subsets, okay, so that it could interact with other things with free will. Well, it did that, and that's what we are. We are individuated units of consciousness. We're these pieces of consciousness that this system, at least part of this system, broke itself into. Now, if you look at our biology, we did the same thing, right? As you had single cells, amoebas, they could only do so much. They could only evolve so far. They got stuck at that point. So there was lots of bacteria running around with their single cells, but to get past bacteria, what did they have to do? They had to learn to cooperate, to interact. It was the interaction with each other that allowed them to make multi-celled things, so that they cooperated in this interaction. As long as they were just individual things, they were kind of stuck at that level. But once they could interact and connect with something else, some other individuals, they started to build things, because now they had lower entropy, more structure, you see, more complexity, if you will. And now you had multi-celled things, and then you had things that even cooperated more with each other with organs, what they call cell differentiation, where you had the locomotion part and the digestion part and the defense part. You had all these different parts that work together. Well, we're one of those organisms as far as here biology goes. We have organs and skin and liver and all things that have to work together to make the whole thing work. Well, that's more complex, more order, lower entropy. So that's the way you go, is by creating complexity, and this cooperation creates complexity like nothing else, because you're cooperating with another independent individual that can either cooperate or say hell no. It's you don't know what's going to happen. So it creates a lot of possibilities. So the system did that, and what it learned is that when you have a social system, which is now what you have all these individuated units of consciousness, you have a social system, and in your body, you have several trillion cells. That's a social system, in a sense. All these cells have to interact with each other. And in a social system, there are two different paths you can take with the social system. One is profitable and leads to lower entropy, and the others are all unprofitable and lead to higher entropy. Well, the one that leads to lower entropy is cooperation. The cells cooperate. They work with each other. They connect. Okay, they care about each other. It's not just everyone out for themselves, out for their own. How much can I get and how can I keep it? It's what can we build together? Okay, we're going to build a multi-celled creature now, so we're going to have to cooperate to do that. We're going to build an individuated, organs. How do we cooperate to do that? So the path of cooperation and caring, and I call that the path of love, is the way to lower entropy. And the path of individuality, I'm just an individual and I only care about me, and I only cooperate if it's the way I want, and if it optimizes myself, I'll cooperate. But otherwise, I don't cooperate just to make something better. I cooperate only if it makes me better. Then that sort of thing is the high entropy approach. That never goes but so far. It's self-destructive. It gets to a point where something builds up and then other things say, oh, I'd like that. And they start tearing it down, right? If somebody comes up with something new, they keep it to themselves so they can benefit from it. They don't want to share it with others, and then they wouldn't get any benefit. So you have those two different possibilities of interaction among these individuated units of consciousness. The one path, the path of love, produces lower entropy, which is evolution for consciousness, as I said. The other paths, and I call that the path of fear, produce de-evolution, which is consciousness returning to a higher entropy states, more randomness. It's unstable. It's self-destructive. So once you have that, then you realize what it is we're supposed to be doing. So what are we supposed to be doing as individual units of consciousness? We're supposed to be cooperating, caring, building something bigger. You see, that's really what it's about. That's where our choices are. And because the system had to evolve based on the choices of its individuated units of consciousness, that's what consciousness does. It makes choices, right? It shares information, but it has to choose what to share, when to share. It's all a matter of choices of what it does. Well, if those choices are made toward cooperation and caring, then the system evolves. If the choices are made toward self-centeredness and fear, then the thing de-evolves. So here you have these, let's just talk about, hundreds of thousands of individuated units of consciousness all interacting with each other like in a big chat room. All they are do is passing information back and forth and making choices about what they're going to say and what they're going to receive and that sort of thing. Well, there's not a lot of traction there for making good building choices. You see, it's just, you can get a little traction out of that, but you don't have a lot of consequences. You can say anything you want. It doesn't really come back and bite you, There's no real consequences to it. So there's not much incentive to grow up or to change. So the system decided that, well, what we need is an experiential environment in which you have a tight enough rule set about the game, the interactions that are going on in this environment, that you do have consequences. You see, in a big chat room, there's very few rules. There's almost no rules. You just chat with whoever you want to and ignore whoever you want to and say whatever you want to. And there just aren't many rules other than observing communication protocols. That's about all the rules there are. So this virtual reality that the system wanted to build, this reality that had a tight rule set, that had consequences, where now the choices weren't just what to say and when to say it. The choices were survival. The choices were, how do you deal with these things? How do you interact with each other? How do you cooperate in any given situation where the cooperation is really important? Well, it started then to build this experiential rule set so that consciousness could evolve more efficiently. And it did that by creating a virtual reality. All realities actually are virtual. The only thing that's fundamental is consciousness itself. If it's experiential, which means if you can experience something there, then it's a virtual reality. Because in order to experience, you need context, you need rules, you need something that defines the experience, defines the context of the interaction. Otherwise, there is no experience, you see. So in the big chat room, that was a virtual reality too, but it was just communication protocols was the only rule set. So it needed a tighter, more effective rule set. And the way it would do that is it would start with some initial conditions and then a rule set, and then it would let the rule set determine how those initial conditions changed. Okay, so that's how, and we do that in our computer science departments. We have several universities who have done similar things. They start with initial conditions and a rule set. They punch the run button and see what happens. How does that initial conditions change under the rules, and see how that evolves? And they've evolved some things that are very interesting that way. Well, here consciousness did that. It came up with a rule set, and it came up with initial conditions. The initial conditions were this ball of plasma, high temperature, high pressure, and the rules were basically what we call science, physics. That's what physicists do. They try to dig out these rules and find out what the rules are in the rule set, and we call those scientific facts when we pull those out. So when the run button was hit, they let that ball of plasma go however it would go according to the rule set, and the rest of it is what we know as the Big Bang, and it turns into this universe, right? So it's a virtual reality that basically has evolved from a set of initial conditions in a rule set. So now we know where that ball of plasma came from. It just was a set of initial conditions within the consciousness system that was creating this virtual reality as an entropy reduction trainer for individuated units of consciousness. So now here we are playing avatars. We're consciousness playing avatars in this virtual reality. Our bodies are the avatars. Our bodies is what developed, is what evolved out of this rule set and initial conditions. So it evolved to the point where these avatars were making interesting choices, you see, and once they did, then individuated units of consciousness could log on and could make those choices, because that's the way virtual reality games work. When you play a virtual reality, you're the character's consciousness. You're the avatar's consciousness. That's what you do, right? You play your elf on World of Warcraft, you're the elf's consciousness. The elf doesn't make any choices. You make all the choices. You're the consciousness. And what's interesting there is in a virtual reality, two things are logically necessary, and it's true of all virtual realities. And that is that the virtual character, the avatar, the elf, is just ones and zeros on a hard drive someplace. Okay, it's a dynamic game, so those ones and zeros are changing, but it's just data in a computer. Okay, it can't be conscious. It's just ones and zeros. Consciousness has to come from someplace else. Well, the other thing that has to come from someplace else is the computer. The computer that's computing that World of Warcraft can't be part of the World of Warcraft itself. The computer has to be outside of the World of Warcraft virtual reality. It has to exist in another reality. A physicist, Dr. Fredman, called that other. The computer has to be an other, some other reality other than this one, because a virtual reality can't compute itself. So here we have this fundamental facts that if you have a virtual reality, the consciousness and the computer have to both be outside of the virtual reality. Okay, and they have to be in the same reality the consciousness and the computer do, because that's where all the action is. This whole virtual reality is just a consciousness and a computer talking to each other. The consciousness says, elf, run away. The computer gets that, makes a picture of the elf running away and computes all the consequences of that. And then the consciousness says, elf, stop. So the elf stops. The computer makes a picture of the elf stopping and computes all the consequences. So it's just the consciousness and the computer having this interaction with each other is what's going on. The virtual reality is just showing you a picture of the consequences of your choices. That's all it is. So here we are, we're individuated units of consciousness, and we are playing these things we call humans. Okay, we're playing these, and consciousness is also playing the dogs and the cats and the horses and the bumblebees, and everything that has a free will choice is being played by consciousness. And consciousness, therefore, has to be non-physical, outside of the virtual reality. And the computer has to be outside of it. So the computer is a subset of consciousness, of this consciousness system, larger consciousness system, and so are individuated unit of consciousnesses are also part of this larger system. And why are we here? We're here to make choices, and these choices to help us evolve our consciousness have to be toward love, caring, cooperation. That's what we're here to learn to do. This is an entropy reduction trainer, you see. So that's kind of the short story. I skipped about 100 steps getting there, just kind of glancing across the top to tell you that there is a purpose to our life. We do come here with a purpose. We are not our bodies. We're consciousness playing these bodies, and we're in this game and logged onto this game because we have to make choices here that matter. Everything, all our choices here have consequences. They all have consequences, and the consequences are serious to us. So that's the perfect trainer for making good choices. So that's why, now take us one more step to connect what I said in the very beginning when I started. That's why this is such a powerful concept socially, is that when the physicists, who I call, this is my own little bit of humor, I guess, I call the scientists the high priests of Western culture, because the high priests are the ones that tell everybody else what's true, what to think. That's the job of the high priest. They define what's true. Well, scientists do that for us. So the scientists are the high priests of Western culture. And when the high priests of Western culture say, this is a virtual reality, and it's a subset of something more fundamental, and that more fundamental thing is non-physical to us in this virtual reality, just like the computer is non-physical to the elf, right? You got an elf, and from the elf's perspective, the computer is in some other reality system, and the elf's consciousness is in some other reality system. You see, well, here we are, and when scientists say that we're a subset of something non-physical that is more fundamental than this world, well, that will just set off a sea state change that will ripple for a long time, because the next thing, there's a logical deduction, and again, no poetry required, a logical deduction that says consciousness must be the computer. That's just falls right out logically. And after you get that, another thing that falls out logically is that love is the answer, that's the point, that's the purpose, is to cooperation and caring. And then we see that, this is the same thing that the cells went through. Differentiation, they interacted together, they cooperated, they made things that were bigger and better, lower entropy, that were more survivable, and so on. That's how evolution goes. And now here we are, we're the result of all of that. These avatars are the result of all of that. Trillions of cells all cooperating with each other, and now it's our turn. You see, we have to take the next step in this evolutionary process. We have to cooperate with each other. Now, not like cells. We're not going to be bonded at the shoulder, with other human beings like the cells are. We have to do it at the level of awareness, at the level of consciousness, not at a physical level. So that's just the next step in our evolution. And we will get there one day, because evolution may be slow, but it is relentless.
Yeah.
Evolution doesn't lie down and quit. Evolution keeps on chugging. So even if we go backwards, it sets us 1,000 years back into the dark ages, we will crawl back out of that hole, because evolution is relentless. So we will end up one day a people that cares about each other, that is not greedy, that is not self-centered, that is not trying to rip everybody off, that is not trying to control what other people do. Matter of fact, we will be a species and live in a world where everybody tries very hard to make everybody else happy, to make everybody else pleased, to give everybody else what they need, because that's the way it is in a low entropy being. A low entropy being is a being of love. It's about other, not about self. So we will end up there one day. And the things that you're working on and trying to fix the economic system that by the nature of the way it is oppressive, trying to get rid of that is trying to fix a symptom of this problem. And the problem is a low quality of consciousness, too much entropy in our consciousness. And if we can fix that, then all the symptoms will go away. And if we can't fix that, the symptoms will change, but they will not have a long-term effect. In other words, you can get rid of that nasty dictator, you can get rid of that bad economic system, but if you haven't changed the quality of consciousness of the people, that change won't persist. Eventually, the powers will find a way to corrupt it to their advantage, and it eventually will end up being just as corrupt as it was before, no matter what kind of safeguards and everything else you put on it. Ways will always be found to corrupt and to do things that aren't allowed and get by with it anyway, because that's the nature of power, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and power will begin to grow. So those symptoms, if we fix the symptoms, that'll be civilizing for everybody else, and it'll make everybody else feel better for a short time. But it isn't going to solve the problem long term unless we also grow up and get rid of our fear and our negativity and our ego and our beliefs. All that junk needs to go away. And
The
then whatever economic system we have will change itself automatically to suit us, because that's the nature of our virtual reality. The world we live in is the way it is because we are the way we are. You see, it's not that we are the way we are because it is the way it is. It's not like that. It's the other way around. It is the way it is because we, the people, are the way we are. And when we grow up, it will just change to suit us. It'll be about us. It'll be about caring. It'll be about, how can I contribute? I'm a business owner and I want to know, how can I contribute to the whole, not how much money can I rip out of the whole.
Yeah, that's one of the things that initially drew me. I'm set up in Costa Rica. I have my own well, my own greenhouse, and one of the big changes that I notice is that there's a lot of problems. There's symptoms of the problems, but a lot of it's held up in the friction of the economic system itself. So that I fundamentally and wholeheartedly agree with you that regardless of what symptoms are changed, unless people really understand how valuable they are to one another, we're constantly reminding not only ourselves but people in the Bear family to that their greatest assets are educating themselves, their charisma, their level of support for one another is some of the most valuable, and if not the most valuable things that they have, because of how important we are in this system together as a whole. And there's a few things that really jumped out at me, so I'll kind of jump back because I do want to share a little bit as well. For me, I've always thought consciousness exists almost outside of the experience that we live in, and for me, I was really drawn towards Pythagoras's rendition of the string on an instrument, and the medium of air was kind of like the universe we live in, and when the medium is vibrated from something outside of itself, that it comes alive through this resonation of what's playing it to some degree, and that it has that consciousness or the divine is actually a separate experience that's now resonating as sort of from the divine masculine to the divine feminine, and then resonating or inputting this information into a system that can interpret it as well. So it was great to hear that, because I felt that for a really long time. So to know that there are now more actualized proofs of what I only had flowery literature related to with some of the stuff I had been reading through Pythagoras' work and my study in music, to know that we're going to those places, because like you're saying, a lot of fundamentally, unless we as a species realize that what we're doing, if we're focused on fear, like, okay, I'm going to do this for myself, being opportunistic, those systems don't work. For me, a big igniter over the last little while was reading through the Buddha's work, the right livelihood or sacred capitalism, that you can be extremely profitable in business by creating models and systems that help people, that are beneficial to one another. And then it hasn't been very highlighted in our ecosystem. But as we change those things, we realize that our society as a whole can be not only significantly more productive for one another, but also free up a lot more space and time for this inner research, the creative arts, and the development of some of these more profound experiences, which often people don't have the time to experience themselves, or not necessarily have the time, or are relentless in their focus, like you were, to have a regular work week, but still go outside of that to develop these paranormal understandings, as you were saying, these outside of the normal experiences that the human chemical data system is interpreting. The other thing I thought was really interesting too was the relationship that you made with the the chat room. We see it very prominently on the internet now. There's a lot of trolls in the early ecosystem of the internet because you could hide behind there's no consequences. But with some of the new blockchain technology, the consequences are actually incentivization. So we see that some of these new systems of technology incentivize people to be more supportive of one another. Steemit is an early run social platform where when you type and create content, you actually get paid for it. You can trade that into Bitcoin. Bitcoin you can trade into your fiat account. You can spend it all over the globe. So now what would normally have been and those communities are way more supportive. Almost everyone's comments on those platforms that incentivize content creation, because like you're saying, this is the data or content information centers, they incentivize content creation, and then people in that ecosystem are almost I've seen almost no one that types negativity, because you can get downvoted, and then now there's the consequence. But on the other side, there's the incentivization that positive content produces a wealth effect for yourself as well. So I had a friend who is able to make a few $1,000s every month just by creating content on these different platforms, which is at this current rate better than Patreon or YouTube for those ideas. So those two really jumped out at me. And then the next subset here too is that the more consciousness or us as a consciousness realize the importance of one another in each other's lives because of the focus of cooperation, that where we go next could be unparalleled. The world we live in today could be drastically different in the world from the next 10 years, because it's a consciousness is almost a brush fire waiting for that next step in cooperation to happen. So for me, it's more it's like not more, but it's an affirmation of a lot of the things that I've gone through as well. But again, I don't have from the layman's standpoint in the scientific world, I have no credible way to share those experiences other than by, okay, well, you can take psychedelics and go through or sacred plant medicines and have some of these experiences yourself. But even then, it's not a necessary proof. So it's so inspiring to know that we're almost always on the verge of going maybe to the next level as a species.
Yes, and you see the work that you're doing and the systems that you're creating and the structures that you're enabling are the things that when we do realize that we're here to evolve and to grow toward caring, then people will look around for more caring ways to do things. They'll be looking around for, how else can we structure this besides this, this greedy, how much can I grab and kind of mentality. Then you will already have defined some processes that can go into place. So that's important. The people who are now trying to develop ideas that are sustainable, ideas that are creative rather than dissipative and tearing apart, things that build, things that feed people rather than take things away. These ideas won't really flourish until there are enough people who appreciate the quality of them. As long as the average level of consciousness quality is very low, then these ideas will always stay in the margins, and they'll kind of flounder in the margins, but they won't ever get into the big time because there won't be enough consciousness quality to support them, because there'll be too many people wanting to grab their slice of the pie before somebody else gets it, rather than wanting to cooperate in some way. They think they'll do better by being grabby and self-centered. But when we do get to that point where there's enough quality of consciousness in the population, then that population is going to be hungry for ideas that work, for alternative ways of doing things, for things that are positive, things that give back rather than just take. And the kind of work that you're doing and other people that are doing in sustainability and so on, then this stuff will get out of the margins and start to take over, everyday life. But it's necessary to work on these, work out the bugs, try them, let them stay in the margins, let them gain familiarity, with people and so on. You have to do that because if you waited to the end, if you say, well, we won't work on relieving any of these symptoms until the quality of consciousness gets better. Well, then if it got better, nobody'd know what to do. Nobody'd know where to start. Nobody'd have any ideas. There wouldn't be any experience. There wouldn't be any lessons learned, that had learned and how to do it better. So it all has to come together, really together. Ideas, that produce fairer, better, more equitable economic systems and more sustainable economic and political systems. These things have to evolve at the same time with the level of consciousness quality, so that eventually when we get there, all the pieces will be at hand to make something that works. Otherwise, you have the risk of not having anything that works and therefore de-evolving for a while, floundering around in chaos because nobody has a clue how to do anything, that really works. And that won't be a good way to go. So the kind of stuff that the people now in the margins that are trying to come up with better ways of doing things, they're very necessary and they're right on target, because I think if the high priests call this a virtual reality in the next decade, then I think a couple of decades after that, we may see some major changes in attitudes that will allow friendlier and more efficient economic systems and political systems to flourish. So I think we're maybe getting to the point where it'll all work. For the first time in the history of mankind, we've got all the pieces together, right? And the internet's a big part of that. The internet's a really big part of that, because now, it used to be that people had no empathy for anybody that lived more than 20 miles away from them, because all those people were invisible. They were just people you heard about, but you didn't actually ever see them or talk to them. And now that's, the world is shrinking and shrinking to where the internet gives us up close and personal to people struggling all over the world and people succeeding all over the world. With that, we become more of a family. It's more of a human family now than before. And that'll just keep on going as the internet technology gets better, and as we find ways to deal with abuses in the system and so on. That'll just get better. So we finally got all the pieces together where we can actually do this thing. We can actually get out of this cycle of destructive behavior and destructive attitudes. So I'm very hopeful that in 2 or 3 or 4 decades, this place could be hugely different than the way it is now. And it's all of us working together in our own ways to help solve these problems. And it takes all of us. It takes you doing the things you're doing. It takes the people that are trying to do similar kinds of things in other areas other than economics, in the political arena. And it takes all of that, and it takes the high priests to see that it's a information-based reality, and that love is the answer, and that's why we're here. And all of that comes together. I think we got a chance of actually pulling this off and becoming a very nice place to live rather than such a challenging place to live.
Absolutely. Well, Thomas, I'm excited for the next jump in the show here, where we go into. I want to ask you more about the specifics of how some of these experiments are carried out and the carefulness that's taken place, because I know with things like the double split test, you're looking to remove consciousness from some of these experiments. So I'm excited to get into maybe ask some more of the nitty-gritty questions about the experiments that you're currently working on, and
Sure.
some of the results that you've had on part 2 there. It's currently 3:38 a.m. in Bali time. So I'm invigorated, but I still want to make sure I keep my regular sleep cycle to some degree. So on the 12th, we'll do the same thing. I'll jump online, except I will be in Singapore. Won't change my time zone, but I will have another place at that point. So I just want to remember that to thank you and to thank all the Bear family. Your guys' support makes all this possible. Also, I will have all of Thomas Campbell's links down below, so you can check out the books that he's written. My Big Toe is one of the like extremely popular ones. He's also he's got another book he's working on, which we'll touch into as well, because I think that the work of progress is always something to be highlighted and endeared, because it's a lot of this stuff is almost a never ending. Like, why would you? Are you going to stop working? It doesn't make any sense. So remember to give us those thumbs up. Leave all your comments down below. Have you had previous thoughts about, are we living in a virtual reality, a subjective virtual reality? And also, one of the fun things I like about this too is that it's a decentralized virtual reality, that we're all interpreting from different standpoints this same experience, and it gives us more clarity on what's actually happening together. And so it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm really looking forward to our when we speak again. And I think an hour, yeah, we're at an hour and 30 minutes now too, which is perfect. Thomas Campbell, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolute treat. I'll chat with you again in another 48 hours.
Okay, get some sleep, T. Joe. You're going to need it.
Yeah, I will.
What you're doing what you're doing requires a lot of sharpness of mind, so you can't do that when you're exhausted. So we'll meet day after tomorrow.
Yes, the day after tomorrow. Thank you so much. I'm going to take that meditative thought of the more I meditate, the longer I can stay awake, because I'm a young man still, so I can just. I think as long as I'm breathing and the blood is pumping, I'll keep a lot of that sharpness to me. Thank you, Thomas.
You're welcome.